Lesson 5, Ritual. As we said in the last lesson, myth is always a story. By contrast, ritual is always an action. Ritual is always something that is done. The action may be energetic, like these whirling dervishes who are part of Islam, or it may be as still and quiet as possible. Ritual can take a vast array of forms, but it is always an action. On the other hand, there are several things that ritual is not. These include habit. A ritual is not simply a habit. To think so confuses repeated behaviors with rituals. While rituals are often repeated, repetition alone does not create a ritual. Habits, from nail biting to gum chewing to smoking, are not rituals. Neither are compulsions, no matter how rigid and necessary the person may think they may be. They aren't rituals. Another thing rituals are not is routine. You might come across some contemporary literature that talks about grooming rituals or daily eating rituals or workout rituals. But simply having a routine does not mean a person is performing a ritual. Rituals are also not the same as superstitions. Avoiding ladders and black cats are not rituals. Finally, rituals are not the same thing as play, not even formalized play such as these mummers are engaged in. There has been considerable literature about ritual as play, and the two activities share important elements. But rituals are not primarily for enjoyment or entertainment, nor are they purposeless. So on this, I do not agree with Johann Huizenga. Why is ritual none of these things? Because, like myth, ritual is about ultimate things. Not necessarily religious things, but things of ultimate value. Faith, ethics, authority, country, identity. Ritual is not about everyday, incidental, or thoughtless behaviors. Ritual, like myth, is about meaning. So, what is ritual? As we said, ritual is always an action. But it's not just any act. A special kind of act, called a performative act. Performative acts are not the same as performances, which are done for an audience. A performative act creates what it describes as it is being done. That is, performative acts are intended to make things happen. Let's look at that a little more closely. Rituals are undertaken specifically with some goal in mind, say, communication with the transcendent reality, or participation in the mystical experience of a people. At the Passover Seder, for example, the emphasis is on how Jews, here and now, participate fully in the continuing story of the Exodus. The emphasis is not just on a historical event that happened several thousand years ago. The example here is of the Native American ghost dance. The dance, in concert with a life of honesty, morality, and cross-cultural cooperation, was supposed to bring a peaceful end to white dominance. Unfortunately, the result instead was the massacre at Wounded Knee. Hardly what the ritual was meant to do. In consequence, that ineffective ritual died out with those who believed in it. As performative utterances, rituals are intentional, not accidental. Rituals don't just happen. This Hajj to the Kaaba in Mecca is a centuries-old pilgrimage that every Muslim hopes to make at least once in his life, and is so important that the crowds often cannot be accommodated safely. Rituals are also structured. Even though elements of a ritual may be spontaneous, as sometimes occurs, for example, in Afro-Caribbean religions that depend on achievement of trance states, the ritual framework must be planned or at least presupposed by the participants. Note, for example, that while the ecstatic experience of this Pentecostal worshiper may well be unique to the moment, the pastor and his assistant have prepared for just this experience. They even have the microphone ready so others can experience it as well. For moments of the unexpected to occur in ritual, certain patterns must be established beforehand and certain expectations must be satisfied for worshipers to get into the spirit of the ritual. To say that rituals are intentional and structured is not to rule out spontaneous ritual, that is, ritual created on the spur of the moment in response to some pressing need. An obvious recent example of this is the outpouring of ritual activities immediately after the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. Rituals of mourning, remembrance, and prayer were immediately adopted throughout the world. Here in Sweden, for example, soldiers who are never allowed to be in uniform without wearing their hats stand uncovered as a sign of respect. In the Netherlands, even drivers observe 3 minutes of national silence. In Moscow and Palestine, makeshift shrines were created with flowers and candles. This outpouring of ritual illustrated how vital ritual action is to humans when we experience distress, confusion, and horror. We band together and create ritual out of familiar ritual behaviors, placing flowers, lighting candles, creating signs, marching, singing, observing silence, rearranging these elements to fit the occasion and our needs. Like myths, rituals are metaphorical. The anthropologist Victor Turner calls rituals bundles of symbols. Rituals are symbolic actions, essentially poetical, evoking the inexpressible. Baptism, for example, is symbolic drowning and rising to new life. Just like with myths, if we take our rituals too literally, they no longer work properly. We would not, for example, want to actually drown someone, then try to raise them up again. Rituals are also multisensory. They are physical acts. As such, they may stimulate vision, hearing, smell, touch, and even taste. Ritual involves the entire sensory body. Like myths, rituals are meaningful. All too often, we think of religious rituals as tedious, dull, and a waste of time. That means the rituals are no longer doing their job of conveying deep, ultimate meaning. Myths and rituals can die if they cease to carry meaning. At their best, rituals involve us fully and bring us into contact with transcendence. At their worst, they are lifeless and need to be revitalized with more powerful, vital metaphors. A ritual that ceases to carry meaning for the participants needs to be revised so that its metaphors and actions are once again meaningful. Otherwise, it is simply a dried shell. For instance, the metaphor of the priest as representing Jesus only as a male ceased to work for many Christian women. Now many Christian denominations include women as priests, bishops, and other kinds of religious leaders. We will return to the question of revitalizing myths, rituals, and metaphors a little later in this lesson. Most descriptions of ritual do not refer to its content. But this is important. The content is told in the metaphorical story and action, and the content is what carries the powerful meaning the ritual conveys and accomplishes. Because ritual is meaningful, it is transformative. Rituals can be, and often are, mystical experiences that change participants in a deep and lasting way. They are, with myth, the way that humans connect to the transcendent reality the ritual celebrates. This can be an extremely powerful experience, as St. Paul found out during his trip to Damascus, and people continue to discover even today. Finally, and not everyone agrees on this, rituals are essentially corporate. Rituals, like myths, are the property of a people, not of an individual. That does not mean all rituals take place in large groups. But even if you are praying alone, and that is indeed a ritual, you are praying in the context of a great many like-minded believers who are also praying, and who have prayed through the ages as you are doing. We are never really alone in ritual. That is one reason why simply taking your bath the same way every evening, no matter how much you enjoy it, is not really a ritual. So then, rituals are performative, intentional, metaphorical, multisensory, structured, meaningful, and corporate. Phew, that's a substantial but important list. So, if that's what rituals are, what do rituals do? What is their function? First of all, ritual, like myth, creates relationships with the transcendent, with other believers, with members of our tribe, with the other ritual participants, and so on. Like myth and using myth, ritual bridges that gap between the earthly and the sacred. It also sustains those relationships across the ages, preserving memory and keeping it alive. Ritual continues traditions, ensures that each generation knows the myths, ties us to the events experienced by our forebears, and maintains a kind of running dialogue between past and present. These Navajos are doing exactly that with this ritual sand painting of their founding myths. As we've said before, ritual transforms people. Some rituals change people permanently, like this bris, the circumcision ritual for a Jewish baby boy, or a similar ritual procedure performed on adolescent girls in some African countries, one that is, not surprisingly, extremely controversial. Some rituals are understood to transform things. Most ritual transformations, however, even the permanent ones, are spiritual and psychological, not physical. Ritual also serves a pedagogical function, that is, a teaching function. It is the means by which knowledge about a religion is transmitted from one generation to another, or from believers to interested newcomers. It also serves as a paradigm or model for ethical behavior and for the spiritual journey through life. As one theorist has said, ritual is a way of performing things as they ought to be. It does this in several ways. First, it tells us the story of the journeys of the heroes of our faith, who set the model for how we should live and behave. It does this by showcasing our myths. Secondly, it transmits the rules of an ethical life. Third, it brings us into a community of believers who work toward the ideals of the group together. And finally, it serves as a regular reminder of all those other things. Ritual also helps structure the social order. It provides the pattern for the social and sometimes the governmental hierarchy. It reinforces social values. It discourages chaos and anarchy. It instills respect for authority. And it demonstrates the importance of law. For this very reason, ritual can easily be abused by authority figures, as history has too often shown. Another function of ritual is to promote psychological health. For example, rites of passage help the individual to successfully negotiate life's peak moments and changes. Depending on the culture, rites of passage may include rituals for birth, for puberty, as in this ritual for an adolescent boy, for marriage, childbirth, and even divorce, and for the final earthly passage into the unknown. Aside from rites of passage, ritual can be consoling, familiar and soothing, reconciling and calming. People seek ritual when they are troubled, upset, bereft, or confused, and find comfort there. Several theorists have also pointed out how ritual can also serve as an outlet for repressed anxiety and emotions, perhaps through ritual practices and through rites of reversal, which flip-flop social roles for a brief time and encourage extensive celebrations of temporary authority figures, such as at Mardi Gras or Carnival. Such rites, common in many cultures, allow the more powerless members of the society a chance to feel temporarily in control, metaphorically anyhow, and allow the release of social tensions through relatively unfettered celebration. The relationship of myth and ritual is a knotty scholarly problem. Many books will tell you that ritual is a way of acting out myths. From a scholarly point of view, that would mean that myths come first, then rituals follow. Sometimes this is so. Certainly many rituals incorporate elements from the myths of the people doing them. Other scholars, however, suggest just the opposite. Especially those associated with the so-called myth and ritual school, such as Robertson Smith, reasoned that rituals actually predate myths, that people first experience things and do things, then develop stories about these actions over time. For example, the myth of the Yacuana South American Indian tribe includes a complex story of how the tribe first learned to fish with a local herb called barbasco, which drugs the fish so that they can just be scooped up. The story tells that the people first learned the fishing technique by imitating the creator god, who purified the very first female with barbasco. Well, now in this case, the fishing practice obviously came first, and the myth followed. Actually, myths and rituals give rise to each other in a chain that may go back to prehistory. For example, the story of the Last Supper gave rise to the ritual of Holy Communion. But the Last Supper arose from a ritual Jewish meal, which itself was rooted in the story of the Exodus. Thus, ritual gives rise to story, which gives rise to ritual, which gives rise to new stories, and so on. As you can see, the myth and ritual nexus continually generates new stories and new ritual acts. Finally, a few words on doctrine. And no, I'm not going to try to explain this chart. You might wonder why we don't spend more time on this dimension of religion. Some religions put a major premium on defining doctrine. Roman Catholicism is one of those. Others leave doctrinal definition to the individual or allow for it to change over time. Doctrines are theological interpretations of the myths and rituals that evolve as people ask questions. What does our story mean? What is the right way to interpret it? What way does my church interpret it? What should I believe? As religions mature, they are almost sure to develop doctrines. Doctrines help them respond to the questions of the faithful, define themselves over against other religions and sects, exercise the intellectual curiosity of their leaders and thinkers, specify who is in and who is out, that is, who is a heretic, and adapt to the social situation. Doctrine is the cause of most arguments among religious groups and has resulted in many, many schisms, especially in Christianity. The example here shows just a few of the main branches. There are literally thousands of Christian sects. Doctrine generally arises rather late in the development of a religion. Let's look at a curve representing the life cycle of a religion. The x-axis is time, and the y, vertical axis, is adherent commitment. First, there is some kind of founding event. A charismatic leader steps forth, there's a sudden social upheaval, and almost immediately the myths and rituals, that is, the metaphorical expressions that characterize the religion, develop. Believers must have something to do before anything else. As those features become familiar, the ethical values of the religion become clear, and finally, doctrines are codified. While these features are developing, the religion, if it is successful, is growing. At this point, it usually reaches a period of stasis and relative stability. Before too long, however, people begin to challenge the system. Perhaps they stop believing in some of the doctrines. And then perhaps they stop attending some of the rituals or begin to doubt the truth of the myths. This slope of doubt fairly quickly leads to doubt about the central principles of the religion. If the religion stays on this path, it is doomed to disappear, and of course, many thousands have done just that. For a religion to stay healthy and survive, then, it must go back to its beginnings and reconsider the metaphors it uses to connect people to the transcendent. As Paul Ricoeur is quoted in your text, the symbol gives rise to thought. If the symbols don't work, nothing will. As they are updated and refreshed, the religion once again starts out on its growth curve. This pattern repeats itself over and over for as long as the religion exists. In the long run, the core of most religions lies in their experience of the transcendent, an experience that is expressed, remembered, and made present in myths and rituals.